Welcome to Fearful Frequencies, where every story is a signal from the shadows. Tune in if you dare. A signal from the shadows. Tune in if you dare, and let the whispers of the unknown send chills down your spine. But beware, once you hear the haunting echoes of these tales, you may never listen to the silence the same way again. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing on Patreon at www.patreon.com/fearfulfrequencies. Link in description. So in the dead of night, when the world is silent and shadows grow long, there are frequencies that tap into our deepest fears. Gather yourself and listen. This story is called The GOATMAN Experiments. My name is Matt, and I've lived in Prince George's County, Maryland, for most of my life. It's a quiet place full of sprawling suburban neighborhoods, interspersed with dense patches of woods that seem to have been there forever. I grew up surrounded by the sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant calls of owls at night, and the occasional scampering of deer through the underbrush. But there was always something else, something darker, that seemed to be lurking just out of sight, just beyond the tree line. It was the kind of thing you could sense but never quite put into words. People around here love their urban legends. You can't grow up in this county without hearing about the GOATMAN. At first, it's just a story told by older kids to scare the younger ones. The tale usually goes something like this. A scientist at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center was conducting genetic experiments, mixing human and animal DNA. Of course, it all went horribly wrong, and he transformed into a monstrous half-man, half-goat creature that now roams the woods at night, attacking cars and scaring the life out of anyone who dares to venture too close to his territory. I always thought it was just that. A story. I mean, come on, a goat man. It sounded ridiculous, even as a kid. But the older I got, the more I realized that the adults didn't laugh off the story as easily as you'd expect. There were always those who would shift uncomfortably when the topic came up. Those who would warn you not to go near certain parts of the woods, especially after dark. There were stories of people who went missing, cars found abandoned with their doors ripped off, and strange hoofprints in the mud. But I was a skeptic, the kind of guy who needed to see something to believe it. I guess you could say I was cocky, convinced that nothing like that could ever be real. That all changed one night when I was 16. It's a memory that still haunts me, that still wakes me up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, ears straining for the slightest sound of something out of place. It's a story I haven't told many people, partly because I'm not sure anyone would believe me, and partly because I'm not sure I want to relive it. But the memory is always there, lurking in the back of my mind like a dark shadow that never really goes away. This is what happened. Growing up in Prince George's County, you can't avoid hearing about the GOATMAN. It's one of those local legends that everyone knows, whether they believe it or not. The story goes that back in the 1950s, a scientist at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center was working on something he shouldn't have been. Some versions say he was experimenting with animal genetics, trying to create a super soldier or some other government project that's supposed to stay under wraps. Others say it was something more mundane, like testing the effects of radiation on different species. Whatever the case, the experiment went wrong. Horribly wrong. The result was the GOATMAN, a creature with the upper body of a man and the lower body of a goat, including the hooves and the head. According to the legend, the GOATMAN escaped from the lab, driven mad by pain and rage, and now roams the forests near the research center. Some say he attacks people who get too close, swinging an axe he somehow acquired, leaving mutilated bodies and slashed-up cars in his wake. Others claim he's more of a watcher, stalking people through the woods, always staying just out of sight, but making his presence known in the most unsettling ways. There are countless stories of encounters with the GOATMAN. I remember hearing them around campfires or during sleepovers. There was the couple who broke down on a back road, only to be terrorized by something banging on their car, leaving deep gashes in the metal. There was the group of kids who dared each other to explore the woods at night, only to be chased by something that they said smelled like death and moved impossibly fast. My friend Jake swore that his cousin saw the GOATMAN once, a massive shadowy figure with glowing red eyes, watching him from the edge of the trees before it melted back into the darkness. As I got older, I found myself more interested in the origins of the legend than the stories themselves. I started reading up on the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, learning about the kind of work they did there. It was a sprawling complex, established in the early 20th century, and over the years it had been involved in all sorts of research, from crop development to animal husbandry. During the Cold War, it wasn't uncommon for government facilities to conduct secret experiments, and the idea that something could have gone wrong in one of those labs didn't seem so far-fetched. But as much as I researched, there was never anything concrete, just rumors and second-hand stories. The official records were, predictably, silent on the subject of the GOATMAN or any kind of genetic experiments. Still, the stories persisted, growing more elaborate with each retelling, and I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of fascination and fear whenever I thought about them. It wasn't until that night in October, just a few weeks before Halloween, that I truly understood why those stories had such a grip on the local imagination. I grew up in a small neighborhood on the edge of one of those thick forests that seem to go on forever. Our house was one of a dozen or so on a quiet cul-de-sac where the trees loomed high and dense, casting long shadows over the backyards even in the middle of the day. My parents had lived there since before I was born, and my older brother, Mike, and I spent countless hours playing in the woods behind our house. Those woods were our playground. In the summer, we built forts out of fallen branches and leaves, pretending we were soldiers or explorers in some far-off jungle. In the winter, the forest would transform into a wonderland of snow-covered trees and frozen streams, and we'd spend hours tracking animals by their prints or daring each other to skate on the thin ice. The woods were a place of adventure and mystery, a place where our imaginations could run wild. But as we got older, our games changed. We stopped building forts and started exploring farther into the forest, pushing the boundaries of how far we could go without getting lost. By the time I was a teenager, the woods had become a place of escape, a refuge from the pressures of school and the suffocating routine of suburban life. Mike had left for college by then, leaving me to find my own way through those familiar trails. I wasn't alone, though. I had a tight-knit group of friends, Jake, Sarah, and Chris, who lived in the neighborhood. We were all close in age, and we spent most of our free time together, whether it was hanging out at someone's house, playing video games, or, more often than not, wandering through the woods, talking about everything and nothing. Jake was the adventurous one, always coming up with new ideas for how to pass the time. He was the one who suggested we explore the woods at night, armed with nothing but flashlights and our own bravado. Sarah was quieter, more reserved, but she had a sharp wit and a love of horror movies that often had her scaring the rest of us with stories she'd picked up. Chris was the joker of the group, always ready with a quip or a prank to lighten the mood, but he had a nervous energy that would bubble up when things got too real. That October night was like any other, or so we thought. The air was crisp and cool, the leaves crunching underfoot as we made our way through the woods. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the trees, and the distant sound of crickets filled the air. We had decided to meet up at our usual spot, a clearing not too far from the neighborhood, but far enough that the lights of the houses were just a dim glow on the horizon. We had been talking about the GOATMAN earlier that day, mostly joking about it, but there was an undercurrent of something else, an unspoken challenge. Jake had brought it up, of course, suggesting we go deeper into the woods than we ever had before, maybe even try to find the old research center building that the legend was tied to. None of us really believed the stories, but there was a thrill in the idea, a way to test our courage against the unknown. We set out just before dusk, carrying flashlights and a couple of cheap walkie-talkies we'd picked up from the local hardware store. The plan was simple: stick together, explore a bit, and see if we could find anything interesting before heading back. We weren't expecting to find the GOATMAN, of course. We were just looking for a scare, something to get our adrenaline pumping before we returned to the safety of our homes. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like twisted arms, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The further we went, the more uneasy we became. It wasn't just the darkness or the unfamiliar terrain. It was something else, a feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us from the shadows. We pushed on, though, driven by a mix of curiosity and stubbornness. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally stumbled upon it. The old building we'd heard about in the stories. It was barely visible through the trees, its outline jagged and crumbling against the night sky. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, the walls covered in graffiti and creeping vines. But there was something about it that sent a shiver down my spine, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. We stood there for a long moment, just staring at the building, our flashlights casting long, flickering shadows across its facade. Jake was the first to break the silence, his voice low and tense. "Well, we came this far. Might as well check it out, right?" None of us said anything, but we all knew we couldn't turn back now, not after coming this far. We approached the building cautiously, our footsteps barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The door was hanging off its hinges, creaking loudly as we pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside the building was thick and musty, filled with the scent of mold and something else, something sharp and metallic that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a scene of decay and neglect. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, crumpled papers, and the remnants of what looked like old scientific equipment, rusted and covered in dust. The walls were lined with metal shelves, most of them empty, but a few still held the remains of what might have once been laboratory supplies. Bottles of chemicals, dusty old textbooks, and broken test tubes. In the corner there was a desk, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers and a cracked, ancient-looking computer monitor. The room was silent, save for the occasional drip of water from the ceiling and the soft shuffle of our footsteps. We spread out, each of us drawn to different parts of the room. Jake was immediately drawn to the desk, rifling through the papers with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Sarah was examining the shelves, her flashlight playing over the dusty bottles and jars. Chris hung back near the door, his nervous energy evident in the way he kept glancing around, as if expecting something to jump out at us at any moment. I wandered over to one of the walls where a large faded map was tacked up, showing what looked like the layout of the entire research center. It was a sprawling complex, much larger than I had imagined, with various buildings and facilities connected by a network of roads and paths. The map was covered in red markings, circles, and notes that were too faint to read, but it was clear that this place had once been the hub of some serious scientific activity. As I studied the map, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the building itself or the eerie silence that surrounded us. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at the edge of my mind, like a half-remembered nightmare that I couldn't quite recall. I was about to suggest we head back when Jake let out a low whistle. "Hey guys, come check this out," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. We all gathered around the desk, where Jake was holding up a dusty old journal. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed and brittle, but it was clear that this was no ordinary book. The first few pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, detailing what looked like scientific experiments, complete with diagrams and equations that were far beyond my understanding. Jake flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of the text. This, this is crazy, he muttered. It looks like someone was doing some kind of genetic research here, splicing DNA, experimenting with animal and human genes. Sarah peered over his shoulder, her face pale in the dim light. "This can't be real," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This has to be some kind of joke, right?" But it didn't feel like a joke. As I looked at the pages filled with detailed notes and sketches of grotesque, half-formed creatures, I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my chest. This wasn't just a story. This was evidence. Evidence that something terrible had happened here, something that had been kept hidden for decades. Chris shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room. "Guys, I don't like this. We should go. Now." Jake was still absorbed in the journal, flipping through the pages with increasing urgency. "Just a little longer," he said, his voice distant. "There's got to be something here, something that explains—" He trailed off as he reached the final pages of the journal, his face going pale. The last entry was different from the others, written in a hurried, scrawled hand that was barely legible. It described a final experiment, one that had gone horribly wrong. The scientist had crossed a line combining human and animal DNA in a way that was never meant to happen. The result was a creature that was both man and beast, with the strength and instincts of an animal, but the intelligence of a human. The last sentence was short, almost an afterthought, but it sent a chill down my spine. "It's loose." For a moment, none of us said anything. The silence was heavy, oppressive, filled with the weight of what we had just read. Then, from somewhere deep within the building, we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Chris was the first to react, backing away from the desk, his face pale. "That's it. We're leaving. Now." Jake hesitated, still clutching the journal, but the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the hallways made up his mind. We turned and ran, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we sprinted towards the door, the growls growing louder, closer, with each passing second. The hallway outside the room was long and narrow, the walls lined with peeling paint and broken light fixtures. Our footsteps echoed loudly in the confined space, our breath coming in short, panicked gasps as we sprinted towards the exit. But the further we went, the more I realized something was wrong. The building seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense, the corridors looping back on themselves, leading us deeper into the labyrinthine structure instead of out of it. Panic began to set in as we realized we were lost. The growls were growing louder, more insistent, echoing off the walls like a chorus of impending doom. Every now and then we would hear the sound of something heavy and wet slapping against the floor, like hooves hitting concrete, and it made my blood run cold. Jake was at the front, still clutching the journal like it was a lifeline, his face a mask of determination and fear. Sarah was right behind him, her eyes wide with terror, while Chris and I brought up the rear, glancing over our shoulders with every step, expecting to see the creature charging towards us at any moment. We rounded a corner and found ourselves in a large room, the remnants of what looked like a laboratory. Metal tables were overturned, equipment scattered across the floor, and large glass tanks stood against the walls, their surfaces cracked and covered in grime. The room was bathed in an eerie greenish glow, the source of which we couldn't quite place. Jake slowed to a stop, his eyes scanning the room, and for a moment it seemed like we had found a safe place to catch our breath. But then the growls came again, this time from all around us, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where they were coming from. "We need to keep moving," Chris said, his voice tight with fear. We need to find a way out of here." Jake nodded, but before we could move, there was a loud crash behind us. We all turned, our flashlights flickering over the source of the noise. One of the large glass tanks had shattered, spilling its contents across the floor, a thick, viscous liquid that shimmered in the dim light. And in the middle of the puddle, something moved. It was a figure, humanoid in shape, but twisted and deformed. Its skin was pale and slick, almost translucent, and its limbs were elongated and misshapen, ending in jagged, claw-like fingers. Its head was a grotesque parody of a human face, with wide, unblinking eyes and a gaping mouth filled with needle-like teeth. It was covered in patches of coarse, matted fur, and its legs ended in cloven hooves that clicked against the floor as it pulled itself free from the broken tank. For a moment it just stood there, swaying slightly, as if trying to orient itself. Then, with a low, guttural snarl, it turned towards us. Sarah screamed, a high-pitched sound that echoed through the room, and the creature responded with a howl of its own, its eyes locking onto us with an unnatural intelligence. It began to move, slowly at first, then faster, its claws scraping against the floor as it charged towards us. We bolted, scrambling over the overturned tables and scattered equipment, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran. The creature was right behind us, its snarls growing louder, closer, with each passing second. The sound of its hooves on the floor was like a drum beat, pounding in time with my racing heart. We burst out of the lab and into another hallway, this one even darker and narrower than the last. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air thick with the scent of decay and something else, something sharp and metallic that made my throat burn. Jake was in the lead, his eyes scanning the walls for any sign of an exit. We passed door after door, but they were all locked or blocked by debris, leaving us with no choice but to keep moving forward. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the growls of the creature echoing off the walls, growing louder with each step. I could feel it closing in on us, the air around us growing colder, heavier, with each passing moment. Just when it seemed like we would be running forever, Jake skidded to a stop, his flashlight playing over a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, the wood splintered and cracked as if something had forced its way through. "Here," he shouted, waving us towards the door. "This way." We barreled through the door, stumbling into another room, this one smaller and more confined, filled with rows of metal lockers and benches. It looked like an old changing room, the walls lined with faded posters and rusted hooks. The air was stale and damp, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. Jake slammed the door shut behind us, leaning against it as he tried to catch his breath. Sarah and Chris collapsed onto one of the benches, their faces pale and streaked with sweat. "What the hell was that?" Chris panted, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that thing?" "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice trembling. "But it's not stopping. We need to find a way out of here." Sarah was staring at the door, her hands shaking as she gripped her flashlight. "Do you think it's still out there?" We all fell silent, listening to the sounds of the building around us. The growls had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. For a moment it seemed like the creature had given up, like it had lost interest in us and moved on. But then we heard it, a soft scraping sound like claws on metal, followed by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. "It's coming," Jake whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "It's coming." We scrambled to our feet, our hearts pounding in our chests as we searched for another exit. The room was small, with no windows and only one other door, which was rusted shut and wouldn't budge no matter how hard we pushed. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by the slow, deliberate thud of hooves on concrete. The creature was right outside the door, its breath hot and heavy as it sniffed at the wood, testing the barrier between us. We backed away, our flashlights flickering as the air grew colder, thicker, with the presence of the creature. It let out a low, guttural snarl, followed by the sound of claws raking against the door, splintering the wood with each swipe. Panic set in as we realized there was no way out. We were trapped, cornered by a creature that shouldn't exist, that was the product of something dark and unnatural. The door creaked under the weight of the creature's assault, the wood splintering and cracking with each blow. Jake was the first to react, grabbing one of the benches and jamming it under the door handle, creating a makeshift barricade. Sarah and Chris followed suit, piling anything they could find against the door, lockers, benches, anything that might buy us a few more precious seconds. The creature let out a furious roar, the sound vibrating through the room, making the walls tremble. It slammed into the door with a force that sent splinters flying, the wood groaning under the pressure. "We need to get out of here," Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the creature's howls. "We need to find another way out." We turned our attention to the other door, the one that was rusted shut. Jake grabbed a metal rod from the floor and began prying at the hinges, his face set in a grim mask of determination. The rest of us joined in, using whatever we could find to try and force the door open. The creature continued its assault on the barricaded door, its growls growing louder, more enraged with each passing second. The wood was starting to give way, the door bowing under the force of the creature's attacks. Finally, with a loud creak, the rusted door gave way, the metal hinges snapping under the pressure. We didn't waste any time scrambling through the opening and into another hallway, this one even darker and narrower than the last. We ran, our footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space, the creature's roars following us, growing fainter with each step. The hallway twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the bowels of the building, further away from the exit and any hope of escape. But we had no choice. The only thing we could do was keep moving forward, hoping that we would find a way out before the creature caught up with us. The hallway eventually opened up into a large, cavernous room, its ceiling so high that our flashlights couldn't reach it. The walls were lined with old, rusted pipes, some of them dripping with dark, oily liquid that pooled on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something sharp and acrid that made my eyes water. In the center of the room there was a massive metal door, its surface covered in thick, rusted bolts. It looked like a vault door, the kind you'd see in a bank or a military bunker, and it was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Jake was the first to approach the door, his flashlight playing over the rusted surface. He hesitated for a moment, glancing back at us with a mixture of fear and determination, before pushing the door open with a loud creak. The room beyond was even larger, its walls lined with more of the rusted pipes, some of them hissing and steaming as they vented their contents into the air. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, disturbed only by the faint outlines of old footprints leading deeper into the room. In the center of the room there was a large metal table, its surface covered in what looked like old surgical equipment, scalpels, clamps, and strange, twisted instruments that I couldn't even begin to identify. The table was stained with dark, dried blood, and the air was thick with the scent of old copper. As we stepped into the room, I felt a chill run down my spine, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. There was something wrong about this place, something deeply unsettling that made my skin crawl. Jake moved closer to the table, his flashlight playing over the blood-stained surface, his face pale and drawn. "This must be where they did it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hissing of the pipes. "This is where they created it." None of us needed to ask what he meant. The evidence was all around us. The old surgical tools, the bloodstains, the strange, twisted instruments that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. This was where the Goatman had been created, where the scientists had played God and unleashed something terrible on the world. As we stood there, trying to process what we were seeing, we heard it again, a low, rumbling growl echoing through the room like a distant thunderstorm. It was coming from the darkness beyond the table, from the shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. We turned our flashlights towards the source of the sound, and what we saw made my blood run cold. The Goatman was standing at the far end of the room, its massive form barely visible in the dim light. It was even larger than I had imagined, its twisted, muscular body covered in patches of matted fur and slick, oily skin. Its legs ended in massive cloven hooves that clicked against the concrete floor as it moved, and its head was a grotesque parody of a human face, twisted and deformed, with wide, unblinking eyes that glowed with a cold, unnatural light. For a moment it just stood there, staring at us with those dead, soulless eyes, its breath coming in slow, heavy huffs that echoed through the room. Then, with a low, guttural snarl, it began to move towards us, its hooves thudding against the floor with each step. We backed away, our flashlights flickering as the air grew colder, thicker, with the presence of the creature. It let out another growl, louder this time, its eyes narrowing as it closed the distance between us. Jake was the first to react, grabbing one of the old surgical tools from the table and holding it out in front of him like a weapon. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice trembling with fear. The Goatman paused, its eyes flicking to the tool in Jake's hand, before letting out a low, rumbling chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. It took another step forward, its massive hand reaching out towards us, its claws glinting in the dim light. We scrambled backwards, our feet slipping on the dusty floor, as we tried to put as much distance between us and the creature as possible. But the Goatman was relentless, moving towards us with a slow, deliberate pace, as if savoring the terror in our eyes. Chris was the first to break. With a strangled cry, he turned and bolted towards the door, his footsteps echoing loudly in the cavernous room. The Goatman's head snapped towards him, its eyes narrowing, and with a roar that shook the very walls, it charged after him. The room exploded into chaos. Jake and I ran after Chris, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted towards the door. Sarah was right behind us, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she struggled to keep up. Chris reached the door first, slamming into it with enough force to make the metal creak and groan. He fumbled with the handle, his hands shaking as he tried to wrench it open. But the door was stuck, the rusted bolts refusing to budge no matter how hard he pulled. The Goatman was almost upon him, its massive form barreling towards him with a speed that defied its size. I could see the terror in Chris's eyes as he realized he was trapped, his hands scrabbling desperately at the door, trying to find some way to escape. Jake reached him just as the Goatman did. With a yell, he lunged at the creature, swinging the surgical tool with all his might. The blade connected with a sickening crunch, sinking into the Goatman's side, but it barely seemed to notice. It swatted Jake away with a single massive hand, sending him crashing into the wall with a bone-shattering force. Chris let out a scream as the Goatman turned its attention back to him, its claws reaching out to grab him. But before it could, Sarah was there, throwing herself between them, her flashlight held high like a weapon. "Get back!" she screamed, her voice shaking but determined. "Get away from him!" The Goatman paused, its head tilting to the side, as if considering her words. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with tension as we waited for the creature's next move. Then, with a low, rumbling growl, it lunged. Sarah screamed, ducking under the creature's outstretched arm, but it was too fast. Its claws caught her on the shoulder, sending her spinning to the ground with a cry of pain. Chris was frozen, his eyes wide with terror, as the Goatman turned towards him, its eyes gleaming with a cold, predatory light. I could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that there was no escape, that this was the end. But just as the goat-man was about to strike, there was a loud crash from behind us. The door we had entered through burst open, and a blinding light flooded the room, illuminating the creature in stark detail. The goat-man recoiled, letting out a furious roar as it shielded its eyes from the light. We all turned, blinking against the brightness, to see a group of figures standing in the doorway, their faces obscured by the glare. For a moment, I thought we were saved, that help had finally arrived. But then I saw the guns, massive high-tech weapons that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie, and the cold, calculating expressions on the faces of the men holding them. They weren't here to save us. They were here for the goat-man. The lead figure stepped forward, raising his weapon and taking aim at the creature. "Stand down," he barked, his voice cold and commanding. "This is your only warning." The goat-man let out another roar, its eyes flicking between the newcomers and us, as if weighing its options. For a moment, it seemed like it might attack, but then it turned and fled, its massive form disappearing into the shadows with a speed that defied its size. The men lowered their weapons, their eyes scanning the room, before finally turning their attention to us. The lead figure stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You need to come with us," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. There was something about the way the man spoke, the cold, commanding tone of his voice, that sent a shiver down my spine. It was clear that these people were not to be trifled with, that they had the power and the authority to do whatever they wanted, and we were at their mercy. But despite the fear, there was a part of me that couldn't ignore the anger simmering just beneath the surface. We had just been through hell, chased by a creature that shouldn't exist, and now we were being ordered around by a group of strangers who had shown up out of nowhere, wielding weapons that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi movie. Jake, who was leaning heavily against the wall, his face pale and drawn, seemed to share my thoughts. He straightened up, wincing as he did so, and took a step forward, his eyes locked on the lead figure. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice hoarse but defiant. "What the hell is going on here?" The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at Jake, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking. "That's classified," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "But you need to understand that you're in danger. This whole area is under quarantine, and we need to get you out of here. Now." "Quarantine?" Sarah echoed, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What are you talking about? What was that thing?" The man's eyes flicked to Sarah, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something, pity, maybe, or regret. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same cold, unreadable mask. "I can't tell you that," he said, "but you need to trust us. We're the only ones who can get you out of here alive." Chris, who had been silent since the attack, finally spoke up, his voice trembling. "What if we don't want to go with you? What if we just want to leave?" The man's gaze shifted to Chris, his expression hardening. "You don't have a choice," he said flatly. "If you want to live, you come with us. Now." There was something in the man's tone, something final and absolute, that made it clear we didn't have any other options. We were trapped, caught between a creature that shouldn't exist and a group of strangers with guns who were offering us a way out, on their terms. Jake seemed to realize this as well. He let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat, before nodding. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll go with you." The man nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Good choice," he said. "Now move quickly. We don't have much time." We didn't need to be told twice. We followed the men out of the room, our footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow hallway. The building seemed to have taken on a new sense of menace, the shadows darker and deeper than before, the air colder and heavier with the weight of what had just happened. As we made our way through the twisting corridors, the men kept their weapons at the ready, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the creature. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the unspoken fear that the Goatman could appear at any moment, ready to finish what it had started. But we made it to the exit without incident, bursting out into the cool night air with a sense of relief that was almost overwhelming. The forest was dark and silent, the moon casting long, eerie shadows over the trees, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the claustrophobic, nightmare-inducing halls of the building. The men led us to a large, unmarked van parked at the edge of the clearing. The lead figure motioned for us to get inside, his expression unreadable. "Get in," he said. "We'll take you somewhere safe." Jake hesitated, glancing back at the building, as if expecting the Goatman to burst through the doors at any moment. But when nothing happened, he nodded and climbed into the van, the rest of us following close behind. The inside of the van was dark and cramped, the air filled with the smell of gasoline and something else, something chemical and sharp. The men climbed in after us, the door slamming shut with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. The van started moving, the engine rumbling loudly as it bounced over the rough, uneven terrain. None of us spoke, the tension thick in the air, as we stared out the small barred windows at the passing trees, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers in the moonlight. The lead figure sat in the front passenger seat, his eyes scanning the road ahead, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. There was something about him, something cold and calculating, that made it clear he was used to situations like this, that he had seen things that would drive most people mad. After what felt like hours of driving, the van finally came to a stop. The lead figure turned to face us, his expression unreadable. "We're here," he said. "This is as far as we can take you." We exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to do or say. The man motioned towards the door, his expression hardening. "Go," he said. "You'll find your way from here." Jake was the first to move, his face set in a grim mask of determination. He climbed out of the van, the rest of us following close behind, our feet crunching on the gravel as we stepped into the cool night air. The van's engine rumbled to life, the tires spinning on the gravel as it sped away, disappearing into the darkness with a roar that echoed through the trees. We were left standing in the middle of a deserted road, the forest stretching out around us in every direction, the moon casting long, eerie shadows over the ground. For a moment we just stood there, staring after the van as if expecting it to come back. But when it didn't, we turned our attention to our surroundings, trying to get our bearings. The road was narrow and winding, the trees pressing in on either side, their branches swaying in the breeze. There were no signs, no landmarks, nothing to indicate where we were or how far we were from civilization. But we couldn't stay there. We needed to move, to find our way back to safety before the Goatman found us, or before something else did. Jake took the lead, his face set in a grim mask of determination as he started walking down the road. The rest of us followed close behind, our footsteps echoing loudly in the silence, the air thick with tension and fear. We walked for what felt like hours, the road winding through the dense forest, the trees closing in around us like a living thing. The moon had long since disappeared behind a thick blanket of clouds, leaving us in near total darkness, our flashlights the only source of light. The air was thick and heavy, the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves filling our nostrils as we trudged through the darkness. Every now and then we would hear a rustle in the bushes or the snap of a twig underfoot, and our hearts would race, our eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But we saw nothing, just the endless stretch of road and the oppressive darkness of the forest. Finally, just as we were beginning to lose hope, we saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It was like a beacon, guiding us towards safety, and we quickened our pace, our hearts pounding in our chests. As we got closer, we realized the light was coming from a small, run-down gas station, its windows dark and boarded up, the pumps rusted and covered in graffiti. But the light was still there, flickering weakly from an old cracked lantern hanging above the door. We approached cautiously, our eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. But the gas station was deserted, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Jake pushed open the door, the rusty hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The inside of the gas station was just as run down as the outside, the shelves empty and covered in dust, the floor littered with old, crumpled newspapers and discarded trash. But it was safe, or at least it felt that way, and we collapsed onto the floor, our bodies aching and exhausted from the ordeal. For a long time, none of us spoke, the only sound the soft crackle of the lantern and the distant call of an owl. But eventually, Jake broke the silence, his voice low and strained. "We need to figure out what to do next," he said. "We can't stay here forever." Sarah nodded, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. "We need to find a way to contact someone," she said. "Someone who can help us." Chris was silent, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands shaking slightly. I could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that we were still far from safe, that the GOATMAN could still be out there, hunting us. But we didn't have any other options. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no way to contact anyone, no way to get help. The only thing we could do was wait and hope that the morning would bring some kind of rescue, some way out of this nightmare. But deep down, I knew that the GOATMAN was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I knew that we weren't safe. Not yet. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the gas station, our nerves frayed and our bodies exhausted from the ordeal. The flickering lantern cast long, eerie shadows over the walls, making the decrepit building seem even more unsettling. Every creak and rustle outside made us jump, our imaginations running wild with the possibility that the GOATMAN was lurking just beyond the thin walls, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the night passed without incident. Eventually, exhaustion overtook us, and we drifted into a fitful, uneasy sleep, our dreams filled with twisted images of the creature and the horrors we had witnessed. When I woke up, the first light of dawn was creeping through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting a pale, cold glow over the room. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering remnants of sleep, and looked around. Jake was already awake, sitting by the door with his back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the horizon outside. Sarah was curled up in a corner, her face pale and drawn, while Chris was still asleep, his breathing shallow and uneven. I got up quietly, careful not to disturb them, and walked over to Jake. He glanced up at me as I approached, his eyes dark with exhaustion and something else, something deeper. "How long have you been awake?" I asked, my voice low so as not to wake the others. "Not long," Jake replied, his voice rough from lack of sleep. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long, slow breath. "I couldn't sleep, kept hearing things, kept thinking." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just paranoid." I didn't say anything. I knew exactly how he felt. The fear from the night before was still there, a constant gnawing presence in the back of my mind. It was hard to shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the GOATMAN was still out there, waiting for us to let our guard down. "We need to figure out what to do," I said after a long moment of silence. "We can't stay here forever. We need to find a way to get help." Jake nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and strained. "But how? We're in the middle of nowhere with no phone, no car. We can't just walk out of here." I knew he was right. The road we had come down stretched on for miles in both directions, disappearing into the dense forest that surrounded us. There was no sign of civilization, no indication of where we were or how far we were from safety. But we couldn't just sit here and wait. We needed to do something, anything, to get out of this nightmare. I was about to suggest we try to find a working phone or a vehicle when Sarah stirred, blinking up at us with bleary eyes. "What time is it?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Morning," Jake replied, glancing at his watch. "Just past 6. Sarah sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Did anything happen last night?" she asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. Jake shook his head. "No, it was quiet. Too quiet, I thought, but I didn't say it out loud. The last thing we needed was more fear." Chris woke up a few minutes later, looking disoriented and groggy. He didn't say much, just nodded when we told him it was morning, and we needed to figure out our next move. We spent the next hour searching the gas station for anything useful, maps, supplies, anything that could help us. But the place was a wasteland, the shelves empty, the rooms ransacked and covered in dust. There was an old, rusted car out back, but the engine was dead and the tires were flat. It was clear that we weren't going to find any easy solutions here. Finally, we gathered back in the main room, our faces drawn with frustration and fear. "We can't stay here," Jake said, his voice tight with tension. "We need to move, try to find a way out." "But where do we go?" Chris asked, his voice trembling. "We don't even know where we are." "We head down the road," Jake replied, his voice firm. "There has to be something. Another town, a house, anything. We can't just sit here and wait for that thing to find us." Sarah and I exchanged a glance, both of us knowing he was right but not wanting to admit it. We were all exhausted, mentally and physically, and the thought of venturing back out into the unknown was terrifying. But we didn't have a choice. We gathered what little supplies we had, flashlights, a couple of bottles of water, and some stale granola bars we had found in a cabinet, and set off down the road. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the trees and filling the air with a cold, damp chill that seeped into our bones. The road stretched on, winding through the dense forest, with no end in sight. The silence was oppressive, the only sound the crunch of gravel under our feet and the distant call of birds. The further we went, the more it felt like the forest was closing in around us, the trees pressing in like a living thing, watching, waiting. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally saw something. A faint, flickering light in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It was like a beacon, guiding us towards safety, and we quickened our pace, our hearts pounding in our chests. As we got closer, we realized the light was coming from a small, run-down cabin, its windows dark and covered in grime, the door hanging off its hinges. But the light was still there, flickering weakly from a lantern hanging above the door. We approached cautiously, our eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. But the cabin was deserted, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Jake pushed open the door, the rusty hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The inside of the cabin was just as run down as the outside, the floor littered with old newspapers and discarded trash. The air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something sharp and metallic that made my nose wrinkle. But it was shelter, and we were exhausted. We collapsed onto the floor, our bodies aching and our minds numb from the ordeal. For a long time, none of us spoke, the only sound the soft crackle of the lantern and the distant call of an owl. But eventually Jake broke the silence, his voice low and strained. "We need to figure out what to do next," he said. "We can't stay here forever." Sarah nodded, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. "We need to find a way to contact someone," she said. "Someone who can help us." Chris was silent, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands shaking slightly. I could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that we were still far from safe, that the Goatman could still be out there, hunting us. But we didn't have any other options. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no way to contact anyone, no way to get help. The only thing we could do was wait, and hope that the morning would bring some kind of rescue, some way out of this nightmare. But deep down, I knew that the Goatman was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. We spent the next few days huddled in that cabin, rationing our meager supplies and trying to figure out our next move. The tension was palpable, the fear and uncertainty gnawing at us like a cancer. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts, haunted by the memories of what we had seen, what we had barely escaped from. Jake took it the hardest. He was always the leader, the one who pushed us forward, who kept us going when things got tough. But this was different. He had seen the creature up close, had felt its breath on his skin, had fought it with everything he had, and it hadn't been enough. He was quieter now, more withdrawn, his eyes dark and haunted. Sarah tried to keep us all together, tried to keep our spirits up, but even she couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. She had always been the practical one, the one who could find a solution to any problem. But there was no solution to this, no way to rationalize what we had seen, what we were still facing. Chris was a wreck. He barely ate, barely slept, his hands constantly shaking, his eyes darting to every shadow, every rustle in the trees. He was convinced that the Goatman was still out there, that it was coming for us, and nothing we said could convince him otherwise. And me? I tried to hold it together, to be the rock that the others could lean on. But I was scared, more scared than I had ever been in my life. I couldn't shake the image of the creature, the way it had looked at us with those cold, dead eyes, the way it had moved, so fast, so silently. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting. We spent our days searching the surrounding area, trying to find a road, a house, anything that could lead us back to civilization. But the forest was a maze, the trees stretching on for miles in every direction, with no end in sight. It was like we had stepped into another world, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. At night, we huddled together in the cabin, our flashlights flickering weakly in the darkness, our ears straining for any sound, any sign of the creature. The nights were the worst, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides, the fear a constant, gnawing presence that kept us from sleeping, from thinking clearly. And then, on the fifth night, it happened. We were sitting in the cabin, the air thick with tension, when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from all around us, vibrating through the walls, through the very ground. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests, our eyes wide with fear. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. It was the Goatman. It had found us. Panic set in. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing our flashlights, our makeshift weapons, anything we could find. But it was too late. The creature was already at the door, its massive form casting a long, twisted shadow on the wall. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and there it was, standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. It let out a roar that shook the very walls, its claws raking against the wood, splintering the door with a single swipe. We scattered, each of us running in a different direction, our hearts pounding with terror. But the Goatman was fast, faster than anything I had ever seen. It moved like a shadow, slipping through the darkness with a speed and grace that was almost supernatural. I don't know how I managed to get out of the cabin, how I managed to run through the trees, the branches whipping at my face, the ground slipping beneath my feet. I don't know how long I ran or where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to escape the creature that was hunting us. Eventually, I stumbled out of the forest and onto a road, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I looked around, my heart still pounding in my chest, but there was no sign of the goat-man, no sign of my friends. I was alone. The road was empty, stretching out into the darkness, with no sign of life, no sign of civilization. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to find help, had to get away from the nightmare that had become my reality. I started walking, my steps slow and unsteady, my mind numb with fear and exhaustion. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know what I would find. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to keep going, had to survive. And as I walked, the memories of that night, of the goat-man, of the horrors we had faced, played over and over in my mind, a constant, gnawing presence that I couldn't escape. It's been years since that night, but the memories are still as vivid, as haunting, as they were then. I never saw my friends again. I don't know what happened to them, don't know if they escaped, if they're still out there, hiding, running, just like I am. But I know one thing for sure. The goat-man is still out there, still hunting, still waiting. It's a creature born of darkness, of something twisted and unnatural, and it will never stop, never rest, until it finds what it's looking for. And I know that no matter how far I run, no matter how hard I try to escape, the goat-man will always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Because once you've seen it, once you've felt its presence, you can never truly escape. You can never truly be free. The goat-man is real and it's coming for you. Are you ready?